Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shekalim Daf Zayin contains two Mishnayos. From the beginning of the daf until the first Mishnah discusses what happens when a Nazir sets aside money for his karbanos and some of that money is left over, is not used. What is the halach of that money? Gemara will also discuss here what happens with his leftover breads from his carbon and leftover nesachim. Now we know that when a Nazir finishes his Nazir's term, the Nazir has to bring lots of karbanos. He has to bring a shlamim, a chatas, and ola, a number of breads, and nesachim, that's wine that goes along with all of it. So the Gemara first discusses what happens if he sets aside money for the three karbanos, the shlamim, the chatas, and the ola, and some of it is left over. So Gemara says that if the last carbon he brought was a chatas, so the money that's left over is leftover chatas money. So everybody agrees that leftover chatas money has to go to a special fund that the Beis HaMikdash had for voluntary karbanos tzibur. That's karbanos that the tzibur will buy to put on the mizbeach when the mizbeach is empty. That's kachei kachim. Any leftover kachei kachim money is used for that fund. The question is, what happens when he brought the chatas already? It was one of the first karbanos he brought. And now the money that's left over is, let's say the last one he brought was a shlamim. So shlamim is not kachei kachim, it's kachim kalam. So according to Rav Chisda, the Nazir could use that leftover money, it's leftover shlamim, and he could use it to bring himself a shlamim. He could bring a voluntary shlamim whenever he wants. According to Zeira, no, there's a special halacha mishmesine that leftover Nazir money goes to that special karbanos tzibur fund. No matter whether it's leftover from the shlamim or leftover from the chatas, it always goes to that fund. So Gemara says there's a brisa that supports Zeira, and there's a brisa that supports Rav Chisda. The brisa that supports Zeira is discussing a case where a Nazir set aside money for his karbanos and then he died, and the brisa says that if he separated out the chatas money, then whatever is left over still has to go to the karbanos tzibur fund. He died, he's not there, he can't use it anymore. Even if the chatas money was taken out, it still goes to the karban tzibur fund. You see, the reason it goes to the karban tzibur fund is because it's a special halacha of Nazir money, and it's got nothing to do with the fact that it's left over from a karban chatas. Now the brisa that supports Rav Chisda says differently. That's talking about where somebody set aside money and he died, money for his Nazir karbanos, and he also set aside the chatas money. He took the chatas money out of the pile, and what's left in the pile, so this brisa says that if somebody goes ahead and uses that money privately on his own, does he violate the Isser of Me'ilah or not? The Isser of Me'ilah is only violated if you use money which is kachei kachim. This money is mixed of kachim, of shlamim, and ola money. Remember, the chatas money was removed. So he's only going to be violating the Isser if he uses the chatas money. So the brisa here says that he violates the Isser only if he uses all the money that's left. Because if he uses only part of it, maybe that was the shlamim money that he used, not the ola money. So the Gemara says that according to Zeira, you should have to say that it's all ola money, because it all ends up having to go to the fund that will buy carbon olos for the tzibur, voluntary karbanos ola. And since the brisa doesn't say that, it says you have to use all the money in order to violate Me'ilah. Obviously, the money that's set aside for shlamim is going to be considered only shlamim money. It's not going to go for the ola. It's going to go for shlamim, and that's why he's not ma'ol. And therefore, you see that it supports Rav Chisda. Now the Gemara brings another similar halacha of Rav Chisda. What happens to breads that a Nazir sets aside for his karbanos and it's left over and it's not used? So Rav Chisda says it has to rot. You can't use it for anything. It has to be left over to rot. The Gemara says that Rav Yossi says that makes a lot of sense, because what are you supposed to do with it? You can't be makar of breads without a carbon. These are breads that are left over. They're not attached to any animal. You also can't use them for a different carbon, because every animal has to come with his own breads. So he's going to have his own. There's not going to be any place to match these breads up to. Every person who brings a carbon Nazir has to bring his own breads along. So there's nothing to do with it. So you have to let them rot, and if it's money that you set aside to buy those breads, you have to throw it in the Yam HaMelech. They have to be destroyed. So now the Gemara says that the Talmidei Chachamim in the Yeshiva wants to say the same thing applies to the Nesachim. The karbanos nesachim, the wine that's set over, that's set aside to go with the Nazir's carbon. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bun said not necessarily, and that's not true. Actually, that money or that wine has to be set aside to be used for the special carbon fund, the special public carbon tzibur carbon ola fund. Why does it have to be used for that? Because the wine for nesachim is kachei kachim. Kachei kachim has to go into that fund. The breads are kachim kalam. They don't go to that fund. It can't be used for that. It has to be destroyed. So now the Gemara says that this halacha, that the leftover wine goes for kachei kachim, the leftover nesachim goes for kachei kachim, and therefore has to end up in that fund. That fits very nicely with two other halachas which we've seen earlier on Daf Vav and on Daf Hey. One is the halacha of Shmuel that says if somebody sets aside shkalim, he sets aside money for his machatzis hashakal and he has leftovers, that has to go to the special fund. Again, that seems to be saying the same halacha, because the shkalim money is kachim, leftover has to go to that fund. And the other is halacha of Rabbi Elazar, who had a machlokes with Rabbi Yochanan, what happens if there's leftover flour from the Kohen Gadol's carbon mincha, the asir se'efa, and Rabbi Elazar had said that has to go to the special fund, and it would seem that the same should apply. Since it's kachim, it should also go to that special fund. All these three seem to be saying the same thing. Anything which is kachim goes to the special public tzibor carbon fund. We now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses what halacha is if you have leftover money that was collected not for karbanos, but for specific tzedakah purposes. So the Mishnah says if you collect for a general fund, and you don't specifically say, I'm collecting for one specific individual, and you had in mind, you intended to use it for one specific individual, but you didn't collect for that one specific individual, whatever's left over can be used for others with the same need. And the three examples of this are, if you collected to redeem somebody who was in jail, or you collected to give something to a poor person who needs it, or you collected to help to fund the burial of somebody who died and doesn't have enough money in his estate to pay for his kavura. So if you have enough left over from those, so each should be used for a similar need. Now the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, what happens if you collected specifically for one individual and you had a specific need and there was leftovers? So the leftover doesn't go into the general fund for those needs. The leftover goes to that person because it was collected for him. So if you collected to redeem a captive and there's leftover money, you give it to him, that captive. If you collected for a poor person for a certain need of his and there's leftover, you give that to him. Now what happens if you collected to bury somebody and there's more money than is needed for the burial? So you can't give it to him. He died. So the Mishnah says there's a three-way machlokes what to do with it. Rabbi Meir says we don't know. You have to wait for Elio and Avi to come and teach thus this halacha. The Tanna Kama says you assume that he wants it to go to his inheritors, to his yarshim, and therefore you give it to them. Rabbi Nassan says no, you assume that he wants it to be used for his burial, for himself, and doesn't want to go to others, and therefore it goes to enhance the burial itself, to build a nice monument or a mausoleum over his grave. Now the Gemara asks, what happens if instead of collecting more than you needed, you collected and the entire collection wasn't needed? You thought you needed to collect in order to bury him, and it turns out that he had his own money. Later you found the money. Now this is not the same case as in our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, everybody who gave money gave for the purpose of burying the guy, and the question is, what does he want to be done with the rest of it? This case is different. This case, everybody who gave thought they were giving for the purpose to bury the guy, but they weren't giving for that purpose at all. It wasn't needed. So what happens now? So the Gemara says, so Rav Yirmiyah wanted to say that it should go to the inheritors, like the Tanna Kama of our Mishnah says it goes to the Yarshim. He would say that this also goes to the Yarshim. The Gemara says that Rav Idi of Chutra said not necessarily. This is different, like we said. So the Gemara says Rav Yirmiyah said to him, look, I wasn't sure, but you seem to be very sure. How do you know? What's your proof that that's what happens to it, that it's different than the other case? And the Gemara leaves it at that. The Gemara doesn't answer. Now, referring to Rav Nassan's halacha, that it goes to enhance the funeral, the Gemara says you build a mausoleum or a monument on his grave, and you put drops of wine on the bier, on the coffin as it's being carried. That gives a good smell to everybody at the funeral, and it enhances the funeral tremendously. Now, the Gemara brings another halacha which we learned in a brisa that says that if you have funds set aside to redeem somebody, you can't use it to redeem somebody else. If you have funds set aside to buy clothing for a poor man, you can't use it for somebody else. You're not allowed to change it from one person to another. However, the Mishnah says that if the people if the people that are in charge of the funds and the tzedakah do that on a needs basis, you don't interrupt, you don't interfere, you don't protest. They are allowed to change the policy generally for all these things. Now the Gemara launches into a topic about setting up monuments on graves, and this will take us into a long Agadata discussion about how tzaddikim are remembered, and a story with Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says you do not have to make a monument for the graves of tzaddikim. They have monuments. The monuments are what people say over in their name, the memory and the Torah that they taught, and what are you going to say over in their name. Now the Gemara brings an incident with Rav Yochanan, which will wind up back in this discussion. The Gemara says that Rav Yochanan, who was a large and heavy individual, when he would walk, he would lean on Rav Chia bar Abba. He would help him walk. But his Talmud, Rabbi Eliezer, would hide from him. This is Rabbi Eliezer the Amira, not Rabbi Eliezer the Tana. He would hide from him. He would not pass by him, and he would hide. So Gemara says that Rav Yochanan was upset, and he said that there are two bad things that this Babylonian, referring to Rabbi Eliezer, two bad things that he did to me. The first of them is that he doesn't greet me, he doesn't ask b'shloimi, and he doesn't. Not only does he not hide from me, not only does he not greet me, he hides from me. He was upset about it. That was all the first thing that he did. So the Gemara says Rav Yaakov Bar Idi came forward to appease Rav Yochanan and argue on behalf of Rabbi Eliezer. And he said that the custom over here is that the younger person and the junior person does not greet the older person. It's considered to be disrespectful. And it's based on the pasuk that says, "Unin aram v'nichbo v'yashishim kamu amadu," a pasuk in Eov describing tremendous respect that Eov had in his early days, and he says that the children would see me and they would hide. So that's what he was doing. He didn't want to greet you because it's not the custom to greet, and also he hid because it's a sign of respect. He didn't want to be rude. So Rav Yochanan was not appeased by that. So Rav Yaakov Bar Idi went further and he said, look, let me ask you a shayla. What happens if you're walking and you have to pass by an idol, a statue called Adura? Should you pass it or not? Maybe when you pass it, you show respect for it. Maybe you should walk out of the way a different way. So Rav Yochanan said, what do you mean? If you walk away, that's showing respect for it. Just walk right by him and ignore him. That's the most disrespectful thing there is. So Rav Yaakov Bar Idi said, oh, so you see, that's why he has to hide from you. Since he can't greet you because it's not the custom here for the younger to greet the older, he has to hide so that he doesn't show disrespect by passing by without greeting, like you're saying that is disrespectful. Okay, the second thing that Rav Yochanan was upset about was that Rabbi Eliezer didn't say things over in his name. When he taught his Torah, he didn't quote it in the name of his Rabbi Yochanan. He just said it over stam. So Rabbi Yochanan was upset about that. So the Gemara says that Rav Ami and Rabbi Asi came to try to appease Rav Yochanan about that. And they said to him, they tried to argue with him and say, look, it's not kedai, it's not worthwhile, it's not wise to be angry about something like this. Anger creates problems. Just like the incident that happened in the Beis HaMedrash of the Tarsiim, the coppersmiths, that there's a machlokes between two Tanaim, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yasi, about what's the halacha if you have a knob, a peg with a knob on it, and you want to put it in the ground in order to hold the door closed or open on Shabbos. Is that forbidden as exera, that it looks like you're building it into the floor, you're attaching it to the ground? Is that an isser or not? Does the knob make it clear that it's a tool, not a structure that's being built in? Anyway, they had this machlokes, but they were upset at each other, and they were tugging over a sefer Torah to show to each other, and the Torah ended up, they tore the Torah. The Gemara says they tore the Torah on purpose. The Gemara says no, they were each pulling an end, and it tore. And the Gemara says Rav Yossi ben Kism was there, and he said, you see a situation like this of anger, the Shekhinah has departed, and I would be very surprised if this Beis Medrash doesn't turn into a house of Avodah Zarah someday. And it did. So, therefore, Rav Ami and Rav Asi were saying, you shouldn't become upset about this, because any situation of upsetness could cause the Shekhinah to depart and end up with Avodah Zarah. So the Gemara says that Rav Yochanan was not impressed. He was not appeased by that. So Rav Yaakov Bar Idi came to appease him, and he said, no, it's not a problem. When Rabbi Eliezer says over something, everybody knows that it's your Torah, you're his Rebbe, and he doesn't even have to say it in your name. It's the greatest respect that he doesn't say it in your name, because it just shows that it's so simple and obvious that it's yours. The proof of that is when Moshe Rabbeinu taught Yeshua. Yeshua taught over everything he says. The pasuk says, "Kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe avdei, kein tziva Moshe es Yeshua." You think every single halacha he said Moshe said this, Moshe said this, Moshe said this? No, he just taught it over stam, and everybody knew that this he got from Moshe Rabbeinu. So that, therefore, it's not a problem. So the Gemara says Rav Yochanan was pleased with this answer, and he even turned to Rav Ami and Rav Asi and said, "Why don't you know how to appease me, just like Rav Yaakov Bar Idi has done a great job?" So Gemara now asks, why was Rav Yochanan so upset about this? Why was it so important to him that things should be said over in his name? So Gemara says it's something that he learned from David HaMelech, because he asked Hashem for Rachmanas. He asked for Chesed, that everything that he says over should be said over in his name. The pasuk in the Tehillim says, "Agura ba'aholcha elamim echsa b'seis kanafecha zela." I will live in your tent forever. I will shelter in the shelter of your wings. Umar says he's going to live forever. Did he really think he's going to live it forever? What he means is as follows. He was being mispal. Hashem, please, that when they say over my Torah in the shuls and in the base medrash, they should say it over in my name. That way, it'll be credited to me as if I am living forever. It's as if I'm actually teaching and talking even many years after I die. That's explained by Shimon Nazir, explains the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. Any Talmid Chacham who says any Dvar Halacha, people say it over in his name in this world. His lips move in the grave. Now, don't literally move in the grave, but it means that it's an extension of his life. Like the pasuk says, "Chech kiyein hatoiv doivev sifsei yeshenim," that what he says with his mouth and his lips is like good wine, and it moves. The lips of the sleeping ones move. This is like a huge vat of grapes that are fermenting. If somebody just puts his finger on it, it'll begin to bubble and flow right away as soon as he puts his finger on it. And this is because when he puts his finger on it, it starts to move right away very simply and easily. And the same thing applies to when tzaddikim say Torah, it comes out right away. The Gemara asks, what hana does one get exactly out of having his Torah said over? So the Gemara says it's like the hana of somebody who drinks conditon, which is a drink made out of wine, honey, and pepper. Mepharshim explain that the three types of Torah each parallel these three things. Rabbi Yitzchak says, no, it's just like old wine. That's referring to halacha specifically, that's what, when that is said over, that's the strongest, that's the most important, and most significant of all these types of Torah that are said. The Gemara explains the mashal that just like when somebody drinks wine or konditon, he has the taste in his mouth long after he's actually had it, so too somebody who's in Olam Haba already still has the taste of his teaching in this world long after he died. Mepharshim explained that he cannot do anything once he has passed away. He cannot do any mitzvahs. He cannot move up his station in Olam Haba anymore. The only way that he can move is if the Talmidei Chachamim say over things in his name. That adds to his zechusim, even though he's already out of the world of being able to gather more zechusim. The Gemara now brings a few more things about saying Torah over in the name of the person who said it. The Gemara quotes Rav Gidol, who says that somebody who says over the Torah of his Rebbe, he should visualize in his mind his Rebbe saying it, like the pasuk says, you should go with the image of your Rebbe in your mind. Next, the pasuk says, Rav Adam Yikra Ish Chazdo, that refers to a great man who says things over in the name of the person who said it. But Ish Emunim Miyimtza, the pasuk says that sometimes you can't find anybody trustworthy. The Gemara says Rav Zeira said that you don't have to listen to Rav Sheshes because he was blind and he couldn't see his Rebbe, and therefore he couldn't fully understand it. And when he says things over, you don't necessarily have to rely on it. Other Mepharshim explain that in other ways, but that's how the Mepharshim on the page understand it. Now the Gemara says that Rav Zeira was very makbid on people saying things over and seeing the person who said it. The Gemara says that Rav Zeira said to Rabbi Asi, how do you say things over in the name of Bar Petaya? You never saw him. So he answered, he said, no, but I'm saying it over the name of Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan saw him, so it's a direct chain of people who saw him. Similarly, Rabbi Zeira said to Rabbi Asi, did you ever see Rav? Did he say things over in his name? So he said, no, I never saw Rav, but Rav Adabar Ava, he did, and he said it over directly to me, and I saw him. Now, on the subject of the Tehillim, the Psukim we brought from Tehillim, the Gemara brings another thing. The Gemara says that there is no generation that had Leitzanim. It had scoffers and mockers like the generation of David HaMelech. They heard that David was told that he won't be Zaycha to build the Beis HaMikdash, and they went to tease him. They went outside his windows and they said, hey, David, when are you going to build the Beis HaMikdash already? When are we going to be able to go to the house of Hashem? So David said, even though they're trying to make me angry, I'm happy about everything that they say. I also want the Beis HaMikdash to be built right away. I would even prefer to pass away early so that Shlomo Melech could become king early, so that the Beis HaMikdash could be built early. Samachti b'amim li beis Hashem nelech. I am so happy to hear that they want to say, let's go to the house of Hashem. But Hashem said, you're not going to lose one day of your life, because the only purpose of building the Beis HaMikdash is to bring karbanos. And guess what? I prefer your Torah, your Chesed, and your Mishpat over all the karbanos that Shlomo is going to bring. This concludes this Mishnah, and the Gemara's comment on it. It also concludes Parak Mitzar from Shekalim, and now we will begin the third Parak of Maseches Shekalim. The third Parak begins with the halachos of when withdrawals were made from the boxes that held the machatzis shekel in the Beis HaMikdash, and quickly moves into the halachos of Meiser Behema, which might have taken place at the same time. The Mishnah says as follows: there were 3 withdrawals made from the boxes that held the shekalim in the Beis HaMikdash, and they were made 15 days before Pesach, 15 days before Shavuos, and 15 days before Sukkot. Now, the term the Gemara uses, the term the Mishnah uses to say 15 days is price, half. The Gemara explains price means half, and it's half of the 30-day period before each Chag when you're supposed to be learning the halachos of the Chag. That's what's meant by price, and half of the 30 days therefore comes to 15. Now, the Gemara says that these 3 times are also the Mishnah says that these 3 times are also the 3 times in which Meiser Behema was separated from the animals. The halacha is, the Torah says there's a mitzvah to take 1 out of every 10 animals which are born each year and make them a meiser, make them meiser behema that's taken to Yerushalayim, slaughtered there as a carbon, and eaten in Yerushalayim. Now the owners would take all the livestock that were born in a particular year, put them in a pen with a very small opening, and have them leave one at a time, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The 10th they would say Harezu Meiser and mark it with a red line on its back so that they could see which ones are Meiser and which weren't. Now, Midaraisa, if you didn't do this, there's no Isser yet to use the animals. It's not like the animals are a Tevel. There's no Isser to use the animals. You just have a mitzvah to do it. You have to do it. Midarabanan, at these 3 times, you could not use the animals. You could not sell them, slaughter them, or eat them until you took Meiser from all the other ones. So these are the 3 deadlines which Chazal gave, that you couldn't use the animals if you didn't separate Meiser Behema after this time. Now, this is only the first opinion in the Mishnah as far as when Meiser Behema was. The Mishnah brings a number of other opinions. This one is Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai says the 3 times were the 29th of Adar, that's the same time, the first of the month of Sivan, that's a few days later than the 15 days before Shavuos, and on the 29th of Av, that's a full month before 15 days before Sukkot. Now the next opinion in the Mishnah is Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. They see the 3 times are the first of Nisan, the first of Sivan, and the 29th of Elul. Why not the first of Tishrei? Simply because that's Yom Tov, and you cannot take Meiser on Yom Tov, therefore was moved back 1 day to the 29th of Elul. Okay, the Gemara explains what the word pras means, as we said, and now the Gemara says, what is the reason that these 3 times were given? So Gemara says a number of reasons for these 3 times. Rabbi Yochanan says the reason is because it's right after the times in which animals give birth. There are 3 different times of the year in which groups of animals give birth, and we wanted it to be right afterwards so that it could be meisered soon after birth. Next reason the Gemara brings is Rabbi Shua ben Levi. He says the reason is so that the animals would be fixed, they should have meiser taken from them, and they should be usable for all the people who are going to buy animals to bring them to the Beis HaMikdash for their karbanos. They bring a lot of karbanos when they go to the Beis HaMikdash for Aliyah L'Regel, on each Yom Tov, for the Chagiga, for the Olas Riyah, whatever it is. And therefore we want animals to be available, and therefore we said everybody should meiser just before then. If you didn't give a different reason, he said because you're supposed to bring it, otherwise you violate an Isser of Baal Ta'acher, do not delay. Somebody who owes a carbon is supposed to bring it in his first opportunity, which would be his first regel, his first Yom Tov. If he pushes it past that, it's an Isser D'Oraisa of Baal Ta'achar, don't delay bringing the carbon that you owe. And therefore we said you should separate the soul side right before the regel, so you should be able to bring it right away on the regel. Now the Gemara says that Rav Yosef says that actually somebody who even misses and doesn't separate it in these 3 times, that itself is a violation of Baal Ta'achar. Do not
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.